I saw my shadow move before I did. It happened in the basement of the old cabin right after I opened the box. It wasn't a flicker or a trick of the eye. My shadow, that dark two-dimensional stain on the concrete floor, slid about 6 inches to the left, like a separate entity adjusting itself. I stood frozen. I was holding a heavy carved wooden jar, and the single bare bulb hanging above me cast a perfect, stark image of my body. My body was still. My shadow wasn't. It was staring down the long, dark stretch of the unfinished basement. This changed everything I knew about death. It changed everything I thought was simple, like physics or light or the concept of self. Until that moment, I was Alex, an architect from Portland who had inherited a nightmare property on Lake Crescent, deep in the Pacific Northwest woods. The cabin was left to me by my Great-Uncle Silas, a man I didn't even know, who was apparently a recluse and a serious collector of weird old junk. I was there to clean it out, sell it, and get back to my normal life. Normal life was now over. If you felt something watching from the dark, or if you ever wake up knowing that your fear is smarter than you are, subscribe now and stay close with Mind Loop. This channel is for the people who know that the veil is thin, and that some things shouldn't just be ignored. They should be feared. The house itself was creepy as hell. It was built in the 1920s, set back in the woods with this permanent damp, cold feeling that the cheap electric heater couldn't touch. But the basement was the worst. It smelled like sulfur and old dirt. I was down there looking for the breaker box, trying to turn off the power so I could replace a sparking outlet. That's when I found the locked room hidden behind a wall of old, dry, rotted paneling. It was less a room and more a small, square stone cell. Inside, stacked on a single table, were dozens of oddities. Books in languages I didn't recognize, dried-out bundles of sage that smelled wrong, and a single, stunningly carved wooden jar. It was heavy, sealed with black wax, and covered in intricate carvings that looked like a mixture of knotwork and script, maybe Arabic or Farsi, I wasn't sure. It felt weirdly warm to the touch, which was impossible in that basement. I was instantly drawn to it. It was beautiful in a dangerous way, like a black widow spider. I knew I shouldn't touch it, but the part of my brain that still believed in logic and money told me it was an antique that could be sold. So I picked it up. The moment my fingers closed around the wood, I felt a vibration, not in the jar but in my chest. It felt like a low internal thrum that resonated with my heartbeat. Then my shadow moved. I stared at the spot on the concrete where the shadow of my feet ended, and the black featureless silhouette of my body began. The shadow didn't just move, it shifted. It went from being a flat, natural projection of me to something taller and thinner, almost stretched out. It was a silhouette with purpose. I still hadn't moved a muscle. My mouth went dry. My heart hammered. I wanted to drop the jar and bolt up the stairs, but my hands were locked onto the wood. It was like a magnetic field was holding the jar to my palms. I tried to rationalize it. The bulb is swinging. The angle of light is changing. It's the reflection from the damp concrete. Anything but the truth. I slowly rotated my body, just my torso keeping my feet planted. My shadow should have rotated exactly with me. Instead, it stayed frozen for a half second, then awkwardly snapped into place, always trailing me, always a fraction of a second too late. Then I heard the whisper. It wasn't in the air. It was in my ear, a raw, hissing sound that cut through the silence of the old house. The language wasn't English. It wasn't anything I knew. It sounded ancient, full of sharp consonants and deep guttural sounds, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a question, an order, or maybe just pure, unadulterated contempt. I dropped the jar. It hit the concrete floor with a dead thud that didn't echo. The light bulb flickered once, plunging the room into total darkness. My shadow was gone, swallowed by the blackness, but I could feel it. A new presence in the room, colder than the wood, meaner than the sulfur smell. I could feel its size, its weight, and its focused attention on me. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, heart in my throat. I was freaking out. I had to get out of there. I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps above me. On the wooden main floor, stomp, stomp, like someone wearing old work boots, walking in a slow, calculated circle directly over my head. I yelled, "Hello!" "Who's there?" The steps stopped. A voice, clearer this time, whispered from the stairs above me. It was low, distorted, and spoke perfect English. "You let me out, Alex." My blood ran cold. The cabin was 100 yards from the nearest neighbor. There was no way anyone knew my name or that I was even in the basement. I ran, scrambling up the stairs, throwing myself against the heavy basement door, locking it with the ancient bolt. I didn't look back. I got to the front door, hands already on the deadbolt, ready to ditch the property and call the cops, but I froze. My shadow was standing right in front of me, cast by the moonlight slicing through the kitchen window. It wasn't mine anymore. It was taller, thinner, and it had what looked like 5 distinct fingers, long and spindly, stretching out towards the door. It looked like a mockery of me, a dark version that had absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. By the end, you'll know why. I can't look at mirrors anymore because the reflection isn't me, and the shadow isn't mine. I knew this thing was not a ghost. It was something physical, something real, and it was attached to me. I turned around, and that's when I realized the thing in the shadow wasn't just a shadow. It was an absence of light that had taken form. It hit me with a blast of air so cold it felt wet. The air temperature in the old cabin instantly dropped, making my breath fog out in a thick cloud that smelled faintly of sulfur, like burnt matches. The temperature change was so sudden and intense that it felt like getting dunked in freezing water. I could see the outline of the shadow, tall and impossibly thin, stretched and distorted in the moonlight. It was maybe 6 feet away. I stared at the floor, but the concrete was clean. The Jinn wasn't standing there. It was in the shadow. I backed up quickly, but my legs felt sluggish, like I was moving through thick oil. I realized it wasn't my fear slowing me down. It was the shadow. As I tried to step back toward the main living room, the shadow of my left leg stretched and twisted on the floor, momentarily moving in the opposite direction, pulling my foot sideways. It was a tug that didn't just feel physical. It felt invasive, like a bad thought forcing its way into my brain. I stumbled back, catching myself on the kitchen counter. I needed a light. Any light? I fumbled for the overhead switch. Click, click, nothing. The electricity was completely dead. The one thing that might have helped me, a full, bright light source to destroy the shadow, was gone. The house was now lit only by the weak, blue moonlight spilling in through the few windows. Perfect contrast for the Jinn. It moved again, a graceful, horrifying slide across the floor. It was completely silent. I couldn't hear it breathing or walking. Only the awful thrum in my chest, the vibration I felt when I first touched the cursed jar. The air got even colder, the cold now a solid, localized point of pressure focused right on the shadow itself. Why my name? I'd find out soon. Why me? Why this cabin? I knew I had opened the jar, the prison, but why was it so fixated on me? This wasn't just a random haunting. This was personal. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find on the counter, a thick, stainless steel thermos. I needed to break the windows, make a run for it, as I raised my arm to throw the thermos. My shadow on the wall mimicked the action, but its arm kept rising. Higher than mine, ready to swing. Then my real arm seized up. A sudden, agonizing cramp shot through my bicep, forcing me to drop the thermos with a loud clang. The Shadow Jinn was actively controlling my body through my own shadow. It was using my darkness against my light. I backed away, hugging the wall, trying to stay in the dimmest parts of the room, desperate to find a corner where my silhouette was muddy and indistinct. But the light source, the moonlight, seemed to follow me. It was like the Jinn was bending the light around the room just to maintain the perfect projection of my fear. I had read a little about Jinns when I was a kid. They were beings of smokeless fire, often malicious, sometimes bound by powerful sorcery. The Merid class, specifically, were known as waterbound or sea Jinns. Exceptionally powerful, masters of light and illusion. That wooden jar I found? It must have been a prison for a Merid, and now I was the host. My soul, my life, was the new jar. I made a break for the back door. It was closer than the front, and I figured the dense woods would be better than the open driveway. I reached the door, pulled it open, and stepped out onto the damp porch. I was in the clear. I took one gasping breath of the fresh pine-scented air, and then I saw the footprints. They were deep indentations in the dirt and pine needles directly in front of the door, as if someone heavy had just walked away from the porch and into the woods. The prints led away from the cabin, but they were not my prints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boots and shaped like large clawed feet. They were fresh. I turned around, and that's when I saw my own shadow standing in the doorway behind me, It hadn't followed my body out onto the porch. It was just standing there, filling the space of the open door, a black pulsing void. It was refusing to follow me into the open air. Why? I knew the answer instantly. The shadow Jinn couldn't leave the house. Maybe the binding was still tethered to the property, or maybe it needed the defined space and indoor light sources to keep me trapped. It was protecting its jail. I ran back inside, slamming the door shut. The shadow Jinn was instantly back in motion, sliding along the floor, trapping me between the front door and the staircase. I was shaking so badly I could barely think. I had one goal: find something sharp and break the jar. I had dropped in the basement. Maybe destroying the original container would break the connection to my shadow. I moved toward the staircase, keeping my back to the wall, hugging the line between the dim moonlight and the pitch-black corners. The Jinn followed, a dark mirror image of my desperate retreat. It was almost mocking me. I made it halfway up the stairs. That was my plan: get to the second floor, where I knew the moonlight was strongest, and try to find a weapon. I took the next step up, and that's when the shadow attached to my foot pulled back. It wasn't a cramp this time. It was a violent yank. I lost my balance, falling forward, hitting my head hard on the top step. I was stunned, dizzy, staring up at the ceiling. The world was swimming. I felt the awful cold of the Jinn rush up the stairs toward me. A dark, vaporous shape was now hovering over me, no longer confined to the floor, but still tied to my silhouette on the wall behind me. I wish I could unsee what happened next. I saw my hand lift slowly against my will. My fingers wrapped around the wooden railing, the old oak rough and splintered. I tried to scream, but my throat was locked. The shadow Jinn was now fully in control of my motor functions, testing its power. Then my own hand, guided by the malicious will of the Jinn, lifted the heavy, sharp piece of splintered wood from the railing. It raised the weapon high above my face. I couldn't stop it. My hand, possessed and fueled by the shadow Jinn, brought the jagged piece of oak railing screaming down toward my face. I braced for the impact, trying to contort my neck, but the shadow holding me was too powerful. It wasn't just my hand. My head was clamped down by some invisible pressure. The air around the shadow felt thick and buzzing, like standing too close to high-tension power lines. But the blow never landed. At the absolute last second, the pressure holding my neck down released. The hand with the wood twitched violently, and the splintered oak struck the wall next to my head instead, gouging a deep, sharp mark into the plaster. The unexpected move threw the Jinn's control off balance for a split second, enough time for me to roll away, scrambling back down the stairs. I didn't stop until I hit the basement door, sliding hard into the thick, dark wood. I was hyperventilating, tasting copper from the small cut on my forehead. It wanted to hurt me. It wanted to kill me. No, that wasn't right. If it wanted me dead, I'd be dead. It was testing its limits. It was checking the structural integrity of its new prison, my body. I pressed my ear against the basement door, where I had locked the original cursed jar. I could hear nothing from inside, just the heavy, unnatural silence of the old cabin. That's when I finally understood what I was facing. It wasn't a run-of-the-mill ghost or a silly poltergeist. This was a Jinn, a Marid, one of the most powerful and feared classes of genies. The carvings on the jar, the intense heat when I touched it, the manipulation of light and shadow, the ancient whispers, it all pointed to the same terrifying truth. I remembered a dusty leather-bound volume I had glanced at upstairs, one of Uncle Silas's weird books. I ran up, ignoring the faint cold trail the shadow left on the staircase wall. I found the book, written in old academic English full of arcane symbols. The title was The Binding of the Unseen. I frantically flipped through it, my eyes scanning the dense text until I found a section marked The Sons of Iblis, the Marid. The book explained everything. Marid Jinns are elemental, often tied to water, Lake Crescent, pattern break. But their true power lies in illusion, manipulation, and the binding of souls. They are not naturally ethereal. They are beings of smokeless fire who need an anchor in our physical world. My Great-Uncle Silas hadn't just owned the jar, he had created it. Silas wasn't a collector. He was a sorcerer. He had successfully bound the Jinn, trapping it inside the carved wooden vessel. The black wax seal and the intricate script were the physical manifestation of the contract. But the book contained a chilling warning. The binding is not to the vessel, but to the host's line. Silas wasn't binding the Jinn to the wood. He was using the wood as a temporary proxy to bind it to his bloodline. The jar was the lock, and the moment I, the nearest living blood relative, broke the seal by merely touching the jar, effectively, the Merid transferred its imprisonment. It explained the footprints in the yard. The Jinn was a physical entity before the binding, a giant clawed beast. But now its essence, its soul was sealed to mine. It wasn't haunting me. It was inside me, manifested as the anti-light, the negative space, my shadow. It couldn't leave the property, because the binding contract was written into the foundation of the cabin, the very dirt beneath it. I was its prisoner, and my shadow was its leash. I felt a wave of crushing despair. This wasn't a monster I could banish with a cross or holy water. This was an ancient, powerful entity that was now literally soul-bound to me by the black magic of my dead family member. I was stuck here, trapped in the cabin, with an entity that was actively using my own darkness to control and kill me. The ultimate emotional peak, complete loss of autonomy. I closed the book, dropping it onto the floor. I needed a plan, not knowledge. If the binding is to my bloodline and the property, then breaking the original jar might destabilize the transference. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, an old, wrought iron fire poker, and marched back to the basement door. I stood there, poker raised, my chest heaving, listening to the suffocating silence. "You're stuck here, aren't you?" I whispered, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the stillness. "You can't leave the property, and you can't kill me, because if I die, the soul-bound contract breaks, and you're tossed back into the void, or maybe back into that dusty box. You need me alive." The moment I spoke the last word, the cellar door rattled. Not just a vibration, but a violent, concussive boom that hit the thick wood. The Jinn was furious. I knew the rules. It didn't want a stalemate. It wanted control. "You're going to obey me," the same distorted voice from earlier hissed. Now right behind the wood, the lock on the door began to twist violently, the heavy iron bolt groaning as something immense pushed against the mechanism. I gripped the fire poker tight. I had to get the box. I had to destroy it. I needed to turn the key. The key for the lock had to be nearby. But where? I turned, looking wildly around the room, the fear of the Jinn breaking through, the door giving me a desperate surge of adrenaline. My eyes caught my shadow on the wall. Cast by the hallway light I had just managed to switch on, my shadow moved instantly, its long, spindly finger pointing directly at the mantelpiece. The Jinn was pointing the way. Why? I didn't waste time trying to figure out the entity's motivation. It was still bound, still trapped, and therefore still a threat to itself. Maybe it wanted me to open the door just so it could get the jar out of the way. Maybe it was a twisted game. I didn't care. I needed the key. I ran to the mantelpiece. It was a massive slab of dark, stained oak, covered in old velvet boxes and strange, melted candles. I swept everything onto the floor. Behind a ridiculously ornate silver picture frame, there was a small, almost invisible notch in the wood. I pressed it and a tiny drawer slid out. Inside was a single old iron key, completely black and cold to the touch. It was the key to the stone cell in the basement. I snatched the key. I didn't look at my shadow, but I could feel it standing behind me. An immense, eager presence. I bolted back to the basement door. The iron lock was still groaning. The bolt pushed halfway out of the jamb by the force inside. I shoved the key into the lock and turned it. The sound was terrible, the old iron screaming against itself as the lock mechanism finally gave way. I pulled the door open, fire poker still raised, plunging my body into the pitch-black, sulfur-smelling space. My phone's flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The little stone room was exactly as I had left it. The small table, the strange books, and the heavy carved wooden jar. I ran toward it, my boots crunching on the dusty concrete. I raised the fire poker to smash the jar. But before the iron hit the wood, a cold, dry hand gripped my wrist. I screamed, dropping the poker. This was the major twist. The hand wasn't mine, and it wasn't the shadow's. It was physical. Standing in the darkness next to the table was a figure. It was tall, impossibly lean, and shimmering, like heat radiating off asphalt on a summer day. It was completely human-shaped, but its skin was the color of burnt bone, and its eyes glowed with a sickening internal orange fire. The smell of sulfur was overwhelming, gag-inducing. This was the married Jinn's true form. It had found a way to manifest fully, separating from my shadow. It was no longer just soul-bound to me. It was also body-present. The Jinn didn't speak. It didn't need to. The knowledge was simply poured into my mind. A violent flash of understanding that felt like a migraine and a heart attack. Simultaneously, it told me what Silas did. Silas hadn't just bound the Jinn. He had promised it a blood relative's body as a permanent vessel. The soul-bound contract wasn't to punish the Jinn. It was a transference ritual. When I touched the jar, I wasn't freeing a monster. I was fulfilling a contract. The Jinn wasn't trapped in my shadow. The shadow was merely the first stage of the transfer, the ethereal tether. Now that I had opened the cell door again, in the darkness of the sealed room, the Jinn could complete the process. It was using the dark sealed room to perform the final ritual. It showed true power. Its grip tightened, crushing the small bones in my wrist. I felt the marrow in my own body run cold. This wasn't fear. This was maximum danger. If this thing took over my body, I would become a passenger, locked inside while it walked the world in my skin. I kicked out, hitting the Jinn's leg. It felt like kicking petrified wood. No give, just immense resistance. It didn't even flinch. It lifted me effortlessly, my feet dangling a foot off the ground. My shadow, which had followed me into the basement, was now cast long and menacingly on the far wall. The shadow lifted too, its black, spindly fingers seeming to stretch from the wall toward the physical Jinn holding me. The married Jinn whispered, and this time, the words were sharp and cold right into my ear. "Your soul is a better prison, little architect. But I get the key." The glowing orange in its eyes flared, burning so hot that I actually felt the heat on my face. Its free hand, long and skeletal, reached toward my chest, aiming for my heart. I was locked in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. My emotional climax was reached. Pure, primal terror as I faced the absolute, total erasure of my consciousness. But just as its clawed fingers were about to pierce my skin, I remembered the only real weakness of a married Jinn: water, elemental. I twisted my body, not trying to escape the Jinn, but aiming for the table. I grabbed the first thing my hand could reach, an old, heavy glass bottle filled with a dark, oily liquid. It was a vial of what looked like old rainwater, thick with sludge. With a final surge of adrenaline, I smashed the bottle against the Jinn's face. The liquid wasn't just water. It must have been holy water or some kind of prepared cleansing wash used by Silas. The moment the liquid hit the Jinn's body, the married screamed, a high, unnatural sound that wasn't of this world, a sound of agony and instant regret. The Jinn dropped me. I hit the floor hard, scrambling backward. The Jinn was thrashing violently, the glowing orange fading from its eyes. The skin that had felt like petrified wood was now dissolving, smoking like dry ice. The air was burning. The Jinn was fading, not defeated, but momentarily stunned and severely damaged. The physical manifestation was retreating. I had maybe 30 seconds before it transferred back into the shadow and rebuilt its power. I had to get out. I had to end this. I looked up. The Jinn was gone, vanished back into the blackness, but my shadow on the wall was pulsing, growing darker, regaining strength. I saw a second carved wooden jar on the table. It looked exactly like the first, but this one was larger, sealed with a brass lock instead of wax. A terrible thought crashed into my mind. What if the first jar was just the bait? What if the real binding, the one that truly anchored the Jinn to this place, was in this second jar? I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the fire poker, raised it, and swung it with all my strength at the second jar, ready to smash the final prison. I brought the iron poker down with a desperate animal roar. It struck the heavy carved wood with a loud crack that echoed sickeningly in the stone cell. Splinters flew, and the brass lock on the jar's lid was instantly bent and broken. But the jar itself didn't shatter. It was made of something impossibly dense, maybe petrified wood or ironwood. The force of my blow had merely cracked the vessel and broken the physical seal. The moment the lock broke, the air in the cell turned arctic cold, and the sulfur smell intensified 1,000 times over, burning my lungs. The invisible presence of the married Jinn was back, stronger than ever. It hadn't fully retreated. It was just waiting for me to make the next mistake. I looked up. My shadow on the far concrete wall was no longer just pulsing. It was reaching. Its black, Impossibly long fingers stretched across the ceiling toward the broken jar, trying to touch it, trying to reclaim its original prison. I had failed. I hadn't destroyed the anchor. I had just loosened it. I dropped the fire poker and grabbed the large cracked jar. It was vibrating fiercely hot in my hands like a live wire. I could feel the malevolent power of the Jinn trying to pull the vessel toward the shadow. The conflict was literally tearing me apart. The dark essence of the Jinn pulling the wood, and my own body fighting to resist the command. "You can't have this," I yelled, my voice hoarse. I ran from the small stone cell, crashing through the door and slamming it shut, locking the iron bolt again just as I heard a horrible, scratching sound from within. I ran to the center of the basement, holding the jar to my chest. I had to destroy it. I needed something stronger than the iron poker. I looked up at the main floor through the beams. I saw a faint blue moonlight shining through the glass window, and that gave me an idea. The lake. Married Jinns are tied to the water, they are elemental. If I couldn't destroy the prison, maybe I could use the element itself against the binding. I burst out of the basement and ran through the darkened, silent kitchen. My shadow was everywhere, huge and twisted, stretching and sliding across the walls, fighting my every step, making me stumble. I threw open the back door and ran toward the woods, ignoring the clawed footprints. The air outside was crisp and clean, but the cold of the Jinn followed me like a personalized storm. I sprinted toward the shore of Lake Crescent. The water was black and perfectly still, mirroring the crescent moon above. I could hear the Jinn screaming in my head, a raw, internal noise that drowned out the sound of my own footsteps. "Stop! You will not do this! You are bound! Obey!" The Jinn was trying to seize my legs again, forcing me to fall. I fought it, every step a brutal mental battle. I reached the rocky shore, plunging into the icy water up to my knees. The extreme cold of the lake water hit me, and for the first time, the awful cold of the Jinn recoiled. This was my chance. I raised the cracked, vibrating jar high above my head, ready to throw it deep into the black water. "You're not taking my body!" I screamed. But as I prepared to launch the jar, a voice, a new voice, softer, desperate, and filled with profound pain, spoke from inside the cracked wood. "Alex, do not, it is not mine." I froze, jar suspended in midair. The voice was distorted, yes, but it was human. It was pleading. Then, the terrible truth of the major twist was fully revealed. The married Jinn had lied. Silas hadn't bound the Jinn to the jar. He had bound the Jinn to me, the bloodline, using the jar as the initial lure. But inside the second jar, the one I had just cracked, was not the Jinn's soul. It was Silas's soul. My Great-Uncle Silas had performed the transference, not to trap the Jinn, but to trap his own soul in the second jar, leaving his body free for the Jinn to possess. Silas had willingly given himself up, making his soul the new anchor for the Jinn's physical body, the clawed beast. I met in the basement. He had done this to protect something. To protect me. Silas's trapped soul screamed the final warning. "The Jinn is in your shadow. Alex, if you throw this jar into the water, you destroy my soul and the binding is permanently reversed. The married will be free to take your shadow's place and then you die. The contract is fulfilled. You must find the third vessel." I looked at the jar in my hands. The heavy carved wood was now weeping a thin, black, oily substance. I looked up at the cabin where my shadow was visible on the porch, darker than midnight, waiting for my mistake. I could feel the life draining out of me, the Jinn's psychic war too much to bear. I dropped the jar. It hit the icy water with a loud splash, but the buoyancy of the water kept it floating just a foot from the shore. I saw the black stain of the Jinn's shadow detach itself from the house and start sliding fast across the rocks toward me, toward the soul jar and toward the water. This wasn't over. It didn't end here. What happened next is even darker. I was holding the key to my uncle's soul, and the shadow Jinn was coming to claim the debt. The third vessel. What was it? If you want to know the terrifying truth of the third vessel and how I survived the final confrontation with the married Jinn, comment part 2 and stay with Mindloop by subscribing. If this gets 1,000 likes, I will reveal how the Jinn tricked my family and how I finally broke the contract.